What would you do if you came home to your family lake, only to find an HOA gate standing on land you never sold? I came back to my family's lake expecting quiet, but instead found an HOA gate standing on land I never sold, backed by paperwork they thought could rewrite history. So I started digging. Boundary lines, old water rights, every mark my family left behind. And that's when I realized something they never expected. This land still remembers who it belongs to. I drove the last mile of gravel with the windows down, letting the cold Montana air roll through the cab of my old pickup. It carried the familiar scent of pine sap and lake water, the smell I'd known since I was a boy riding in my father's truck, my forehead pressed to the glass, watching the shoreline flash between the trees. For the first time in months, I felt something close to steady. My mother's passing had left a hollow in me I still couldn't name, but this place, our lake, our land, had always been where the noise in my head went quiet. That was what I expected to return to. Quiet. What I found instead made my hands go still on the wheel. A gate. A massive wooden gate made of fresh-stained timbers, anchored into two stone pillars that hadn't existed 18 months ago. The kind of gate you see at the entrance of expensive communities in Colorado ski towns, not on a family-owned lake hidden deep in the backcountry. A metal sign hung on thick chains across the front, polished bright under the late afternoon sun. Private HOA property, no trespassing, no public access. My tires crunched to a stop 20 feet away. I stepped out slowly, like maybe the cold would sting me awake and I'd see the dirt track I'd grown up on. But the gate didn't flicker away. It stood there, real, solid, intentional, cutting me off from the road my grandfather had carved himself with a borrowed bulldozer in 1964. I walked toward it, boots sinking into gravel that hadn't been there when I left for Wyoming last year. Someone had spent serious money grading this road, the kind of money that doesn't get spent for fun. I touched the timber, smooth, new, expensive. My chest tightened. Behind the gate, the road curved downhill, and through the spaces between the boards, I could see the shimmer of water, my family's lake, broken now by straight lines and angles that didn't belong. Where there should have been open shore, I saw concrete, dock pylons, a boardwalk, and the gleam of metal railings outlining what looked like a marina. A marina, on our lake. I stepped back, breath frosting in front of me. "No," I said under my breath, like saying it would undo it. "No, this isn't right." The last time I'd stood here, the only thing beyond this point had been a dirt trail and the kind of silence you can still feel in your ribs. The lake had always been untouched. 47 acres of water and timber passed from my grandfather to my mother, and now to me. We never sold a square inch of it, never leased, never asked for anything except peace. I walked the length of the gate, scanning the ground, the corners, the posts. A keypad was mounted to one pillar, glowing faintly. Professional installation. On the other side of the gate, a surveillance camera blinked red. Someone not only built this, they expected resistance. The gate ended at a tall metal fence that ran in both directions, following the contour of the land. I traced it with my eyes until it disappeared into the tree line, a thin black line slicing through what used to be free open space. The fence cut right through the stretch of land where my father taught me to cast a line, where I slipped on wet moss as a kid and cracked my shin on a rock, where my mother used to sit on the hood of the truck with a thermos of coffee. A fence, a gate, and a sign telling me I didn't belong. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I looked at the sign again, reading each word as if one might magically make sense of the others. HOA property. There had never been an HOA here. No board, no bylaws, no committees about paint colors or lawn height. This wasn't a subdivision. It was a lake at the end of a dirt road with only one cabin. Ours. I took a slow breath and forced my mind to settle. Emotion wouldn't help me understand this. Facts would. I walked back to my truck, pulled the old leather folder from behind the seat, and laid it on the hood. Inside were the papers my mother kept. Deed copies, maps, her father's notes, the water rights certificates. Documents older than I was, untouched, unchallenged, unbroken. Nothing in those papers said anything about a sale, or an easement, or any permission for a homeowners association to plant itself here like a parasite. I flipped through page after page until the wind caught one and lifted it. I set a hand on it quickly, palm pressing down on the old paper as if holding it could tether the world back in place. "That gate wasn't here," I whispered. "None of this was here." A truck engine hummed faintly in the distance, someone driving on the other side of the gate. I stepped back around the pillar to look. A white SUV rolled slowly down the paved path that used to be dirt, its headlights sweeping over the new marina. The driver didn't glance toward me. He didn't have to. The gate kept me outside. My jaw clenched. Whoever built this was confident. Confident enough to fence off land that wasn't theirs, to slap up warnings to turn a private lake into some kind of curated development. Confident enough to assume no one would come back to challenge it. I turned in a slow circle, looking at the trees, the mountains, the quiet water beyond the posts. Everything was familiar, yet twisted, like someone had taken my memories and redrawn them with straight lines and corporate money. Who did this? Who decided our land was up for grabs? The wind picked up, rattling the sign against its chain. The sound echoed across the clearing, sharp, metallic, final. I stood there until the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the gravel. The cold crept into my sleeves, but I didn't move. Couldn't. My mind was running through every possibility, every name, every neighbor who might know something. But one question rose above the rest, steady and unavoidable, as the first stars pricked through the sky. Who gave anyone the right to put a gate on land that had never been sold? I forced myself back into the truck, cranked the heater, and let the engine idle while darkness settled over the woods. The headlights washed over the gate, the surveillance camera blinking like a patient, unblinking eye. I wasn't going to solve anything standing in the road. I needed daylight. I needed clarity. And I needed to see if the cabin, the one thing the world hadn't touched, was still waiting for me. By the time I reached it, the moon was up, pale blue light spilling across the clearing. The old log walls looked battered but familiar, the screen door still hanging crooked on its hinge. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and took in a breath of dust, pine, and the faint echo of my mother's lavender soap that clung to everything she touched. I flipped the light switch. Nothing. The power had been cut months ago, maybe longer. Fine. Gas lanterns still hung on nails by the window. I lit one, set it on the table, and spread out the folder of documents under its warm glow. My grandfather's handwriting meandered across old maps, each stroke done by hand, each note a memory preserved in ink. The boundaries were clear. The shoreline was ours. Every foot of it. No HOA, no sale, no permission given. I didn't sleep that night. I dozed in the armchair for maybe an hour before waking to a stiff neck and the sound of early morning wind brushing through the pines. When the first light crept over the ridge, I threw on boots, grabbed the folder, and headed straight back toward the gate. I wasn't planning to confront anyone, not yet. But I wanted to see it again, with rested eyes. The gate looked even worse in daylight. The words, "Private HOA property," glared back at me like a dare. The wood was pristine, unweathered, the bolts still silver. Someone had put it up recently, maybe within the last few months, Too recent for my mother to have missed it, unless she hadn't been well enough to understand what was happening. That thought hit like a punch. I tightened my jaw, steadying myself. A crunch of tires on pavement broke the morning silence. A black SUV rolled toward the gate from the opposite side. It stopped just behind the bars, tinted window sliding down with the smoothness of a vehicle that had never seen a gravel road until this place was paved. A woman leaned out. Blonde hair pulled tight into a low ponytail. Bright pink jacket zipped to her collarbone. Strong frame. Eyes sharp as cold metal. "Can I help you?" she asked, the tone clipped and chilly. I knew instantly who she was before she said her name. Every lake town has one. Every HOA has a queen bee. "My name's Remy Cole," I said. "My family owns this lake." Her eyebrows lifted just slightly, just enough to show she'd been expecting me, just not this early. "Oh, you must be the son." She gave a small, practiced smile. Not warm, not even polite, just something she'd learned to do in real estate meetings. "I'm Bethany Reed, HOA president." "That sign," I said, gesturing toward the metal letters, "needs to come down. This gate, too. None of this belongs here." Bethany rested her elbow on the window frame, expression stiffening as if I'd insulted her personally. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said. "The Lakeshore Community Association acquired this land 3 years ago, fully documented, fully approved. We've invested millions into restoring this lake and building amenities the community can enjoy." I stared at her. "Restoring? By putting in a marina the size of a small-town pier?" Her smile sharpened. "Progress doesn't wait for nostalgia, Mr. Cole." I took a slow breath. "Show me the paperwork." "I assumed you'd ask." She reached down and lifted a slim leather portfolio from the passenger seat. She held it against the gate, flipping it open with meticulous precision, as though she'd rehearsed this moment. Inside were notarized documents, a county approval stamp, and a color-coded map. She tapped the map. "This is the revised boundary line. Your family retained the northern ridge and the cabin structure. The shoreline, 12 acres of it, was sold to the HOA for development. It's all legal. You'll see your mother's signature right here." The words scraped across my nerves. "My mother never sold any lakefront property." "Oh," I said, voice steady but clipped. "Not 1 acre." Bethany tilted her head. "I understand this must be hard. Grief creates confusion. Let me see the signature." She pivoted the map toward me. There it was. My mother's name, Eileen Cole, looped across the bottom of a purchase agreement. The ink bold. Too bold. I'd seen her sign forms thousands of times. When her hands weakened during her last months, her writing had changed. Shakier, thinner, lighter. This signature didn't match that. Not even close. "This isn't hers," I said quietly. Bethany tapped the page again with one manicured finger. "It's notarized. County verified. Recorded. If you'd like to dispute it, you're welcome to contact a lawyer. But as of today, this land is under the HOA's jurisdiction." She withdrew the folder and closed the window with calculated finality, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the tinted glass. The SUV rolled forward, the gate clicking open from a remote signal I wasn't privy to. The wood beams parted just enough for her to glide through. Then the gate closed, locking me out again. I stood there, pulse thudding hard in my ears. Someone had forged my mother's signature. Someone had altered boundary lines drawn by my grandfather's hands 60 years ago. Someone had taken my family's lake, piece by piece, document by document, and stamped it with bureaucratic authority. I looked at the padlock, at the keypad, at the fence running through the trees. Whoever orchestrated this thought paperwork would be enough to bury the truth. Thought a signature on a form outweighed a lifetime of memory, sweat, and history. thought no one would ever come home to question it. The wind swept across the lake, carrying the faint sound of construction, saws humming, hammers striking, men shouting. Behind the gate, they were building more. I picked up my folder of old deeds, gripping them tight enough that the edges cut into my palm. If the papers they had were real, they wouldn't have needed a gate. If the signature was genuine, Bethany Reed wouldn't have spoken like someone hiding behind legal shields. If the land had truly been sold, I wouldn't feel this deep, instinctive wrongness at the pit of my chest. I turned toward the cabin, the cold morning breeze brushing against my back, and walked away from the gate without looking back. One thing had become unmistakably clear. Someone had rewritten the story of this lake, and they expected me to accept the ending without question. But I wasn't going to. Not when the land itself remembered differently. The morning sun crawled over the tree line as I left the cabin again, following the narrow footpath that once circled the shoreline like a loose belt. The frost was still thick on the grass, crunching softly under my boots. I didn't bring the folder of documents this time. I brought only myself and the memory of every bend, every stone, every tree that marked this land long before committees or bylaws tried to claim it. The air by the water carried a low hum, machines from the development across the lake, saws whining in an impatient rhythm. Each sound was a violation. This place used to wake only to wind, water, and the occasional osprey. Now it woke to construction crews without the courtesy of guilt. I walked along the curve of the lake, ducking under a fallen pine branch that had always hung low. My father used to joke it was the lake's front porch light, too stubborn to fall completely. A few more yards and I reached the old post, just a weathered piece of cedar hammered into the ground decades ago. It leaned slightly now, but still held. This was the northern boundary marker. My grandfather carved a crooked C near its base for coal. My father traced it every year with fresh stain, keeping the memory alive even as the wood peeled. I crouched to brush the frost off the carved letter. The wood was rough beneath my fingertips, cracked with age but undeniably ours. Then I looked up. The HOA fence ran in a straight black line about 40 feet south of this post, cutting directly across a chunk of our land. The metal bars glinted in the sunlight, cold, deliberate. They didn't even try to hide it, I muttered. The water lapped against the rocks, each ripple catching light. The lake had a way of reflecting truth back more clearly than any document. Dad used to say the shoreline was nature's deed. You can lie on paper, but not on the land. I kept walking. The path grew narrower. Frost gave way to patches of soft, thawing dirt. When the sun reached full strength, the smell of damp soil filled the air, waking something deep inside me. Old summers, fishing lines, the whistle of my father calling me back before dark. The land hadn't forgotten. Neither had I. Ahead, the remnants of the original dock jutted out like broken ribs. It had been our family's dock, built by my grandfather in 1972. He nailed those boards by hand, hauling cedar planks from his truck, while my father held the nails between his teeth. Over the years, storms and ice pulled most of it apart, but the main beams still sat rooted under the water. You could feel the weight of history in them. But now, beyond those old beams stood a brand new floating marina, polished and perfect. It stretched across the shoreline like an intruder with no intention of leaving. White buoys bobbed beside gleaming aluminum walkways. A cluster of boats rocked gently in their slips. Ski boats, fishing skiffs, even a few small yachts. Yachts. On our quiet lake. I stood there so long the wind changed, carrying voices across the water. Construction workers shouted measurements. A radio played static-laced country music. A power drill squealed. Everything that used to be soft and untouched now buzzed like a city center. I backed up the trail to where the brush thickened. A rusted cattle gate, half buried in weeds, marked another of my grandfather's boundaries. He'd never owned cattle. He installed the gate because he liked the feeling of coming home to something that opened only for family. I placed a hand on it, feeling the familiar groove in the metal where his wedding ring had scratched it year after year. The HOA's fence, 50 feet away, didn't follow any natural marker. It cut straight through, obeying nothing but the lines someone drew on a revised map. Someone who either didn't know this land or didn't care. I turned at the sound of footsteps behind me. A man with a faded denim jacket, patchy beard, and a limp that bent his right leg approached through the trees. He carried a small shovel and a thermos tucked under one arm. "Remy Cole," he said before I could speak. "I heard you were back." I squinted. "Carl? Carl Bennett?" He nodded, smiling with the same easy calm he'd always carried. Carl used to maintain the old spillway near the north end of the lake. My grandfather trusted him with everything water-related, and that wasn't trust he gave lightly. "You're the last person I expected to see walking this trail," I said. He chuckled. "I try to get out here before the HOA patrols drive by in their little carts. They don't like folks wandering around the community shoreline." Their words, not mine. "Community shoreline," I repeated. "This whole lake belongs to one community, my family." Carl nodded gravely. "I know. And your granddad knew it. Marked every boundary by hand. That black metal fence over there?" He jerked his chin toward the new structure. "Never belonged. Never matched the land." I stepped closer. "You're sure about the boundaries?" "Son," he said, lifting his thermos as if making a toast. "I've walked this lake since before you were born. Helped your father rebuild the dock 3 times. I can still find every marker blindfolded, and none of them match what those folks are claiming." My breath tightened with something between relief and renewed anger. "Bethany Reed showed me a contract. Claimed my mother sold the shoreline." Carl's face hardened, a rare sight coming from him. "Your mother? She never sold a day in her life. I brought her groceries when she was sick. She could barely sign a check toward the end. She sure wasn't signing away your inheritance." My pulse thudded. I knew it. "Remy," he said quietly, "I don't know what papers they have, but they don't match the land, and land doesn't lie." The lake shimmered behind him, waves rolling gently under the morning wind, as if nodding in agreement. "Come on," Carl said. "I want to show you something." We cut through the brush to an outcropping of rocks shaped like a bent horseshoe. My grandfather called it Twin Ridge because from above it looked like 2 curved fingers reaching into the water. Carl pointed at a small cluster of stones at its base. "See that?" he asked. "Your grandfather stacked these himself. Boundary marker, northern point. Been here since the 70s. But look." He gestured toward a bright orange HOA survey flag stuck 10 yards away. "They marked their boundary there. If they're right, your granddad didn't know his own land. But he did." I exhaled slowly. "They didn't just shift the boundary. They erased it." "Or they're trying to," he said. The wind gusted suddenly, blowing a spray of cold mist off the lake. Carl zipped his jacket, staring across the water at the marina. "You're not the first to ask questions. Couple other old-timers tried. HOA shut them down quick, threatened fines for trespass and interference. One of them moved away." I clenched my fists. "They can't shut me down. Not when this lake is mine." Carl gave me a long, steady look. "Then you're gonna need more than memory. You'll need proof stronger than whatever they cooked up. And you better get it fast. They expand that marina another 50 feet, and half those old markers'll be gone." The gravity of those words settled deep. Proof. That was the next step. Not anger, not shouting at a locked gate, not nostalgia for what used to be. Proof that could stand up against whatever documents Bethany Reed pulled from her portfolio. I looked back toward the woods where the old boundary markers hid beneath moss and thyme. The lake remembered differently, and now I had a witness who remembered with it. Carl patted my shoulder gently. "Glad you're back, son. This place needs someone willing to fight for what's true." I watched him walk back up the trail, his limp bending with each step, his thermos swinging at his side. The wind picked up again, rustling the branches overhead. I turned slowly toward the direction of town, toward the county office, toward the courthouse. Proof. If Bethany wanted to claim the paper was law, then I would bring papers of my own. Real ones. The ones that told the truth. By the time I reached town, the sky had brightened into a pale Montana blue, thin streaks of cloud stretching across it like scratches in glass. I parked outside the county records office, a squat brick building that hadn't been renovated since the late 70s. The flag out front fluttered on a thin metal pole, the wind sharp enough to make it snap. Inside, the air smelled like paper, old paper, the kind that carries dust from 2 generations ago. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls. A woman at the counter looked up over her glasses when I approached. Her silver hair pulled into a bun tight enough to lift her eyebrows. "Morning," she said. "What can I help you with?" "I need property records for the Coal Lake tract. Everything you've got. Deeds, maps, water rights, historic filings, all of it." She studied me for a moment, eyes narrowing. "That's a lot of paperwork. You doing some kind of appraisal?" "No," I said. "I'm doing some correcting." She hummed, then motioned me toward a row of cabinets. "Section C. Should be under your family name. Coal." I pulled open the metal drawer. It screeched loud enough to echo down the hall, like the cabinet was protesting the intrusion. Inside were files, yellowed and soft around the edges. I sifted through them until I found it. A thick manila folder labeled Coal Lake, 1962 deed plus subsequent records. The weight of it felt like holding a piece of my grandfather himself. I set it on a nearby table and opened it. The first page was the deed from 1962, my grandfather's name in steady, bold handwriting, the purchase stamped and recorded with a seal that hadn't faded at all. The next pages were maps, each drawn by surveyors who'd walked these woods by hand. The same boundary lines repeated, unchanged, decade after decade. Nothing in these records mentioned a sale. Nothing showed a transfer. Nothing acknowledged any HOA. The paper was clear. Bethany's story wasn't. I was still reviewing the documents when the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the sound of boots on old floorboards. I didn't look up until I heard a familiar voice. "Well," Sarah Mitchell said, "I didn't expect to see you back in town this soon." She stood with her hands on her hips, dark hair tucked into a wool hat, a folder of legal files under one arm. Sarah had worked water rights cases in this county for nearly 15 years. She and my mother had known each other well. My mother trusted her more than any attorney I'd ever met. "Sarah," I said, straightening, "I was hoping to find you." "You found more than me, it looks like." She eyed the stack of documents. "I heard about the gates. Figured you'd be in here sooner or later." I exhaled. "The HOA claims my mother sold 12 acres of shoreline. They showed me a contract. Her signature is on it." Sarah's expression didn't shift, but her jaw tightened. "Show me." I handed her the copy Bethany had displayed through the SUV window. Even through the glass, I had snapped a photo. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. She held my phone close to her face, her eyes scanning the signature. Then she set the phone down carefully, like it might shatter if she breathed too hard. "Remy," she said slowly, "your mother never signed this." "I know," I said. "No, I mean she couldn't have signed this." She took a breath. "Your mother's medical records from that period. Late-stage medication, tremors, cognitive decline. She wasn't capable of signing something this clean." My pulse climbed. So it's forged. In my professional opinion, she said. Yes, but we'll need more than opinion. She pulled a chair out and sat, flipping the county documents toward herself like she was reading chapters of a book. This is the original deed, she said, tapping the page. Your grandfather recorded it properly. No contested boundaries. Clear shoreline description. All land from the water's natural edge to the timber line. She flipped pages, humming under her breath. These are water rights certificates. You have priority rights dating back 60 years. No HOA can override that. No county permit can override that. She flipped again. And here, boundary surveys from the 80s, the 90s, all matching the original. No adjustments. No disputes. She leaned back in her chair. So unless your mother somehow sold land, she didn't have authority to separate from this deed, which she didn't. The HOA built their marina on private property. I stared at the documents spread across the table. They shifted the boundary. Or they drew their own, she said. Happens more often than people think. Developers assume no one keeps old records. They redraw lines, push fences, build first, fight later. But this, she tapped the unopened half of the file, this protects you. I opened it. Inside were more maps, more signatures, more stamps. Then something caught my eye. A survey from 1994 included a photograph. My father at the shoreline, pointing to a cluster of stones, the very same ones Carl had shown me. The caption read, Northern Marker, verified. It broke something open inside me. Not grief, not anger, certainty. Sarah leaned forward. Remy, you have the original deed, supporting records, water rights, and a lifetime of physical landmarks to back them up. What the HOA has is a single contract, with a questionable signature, and a county stamp that can be challenged if we find inconsistencies in the approval process. I nodded slowly. Bethany acted like she knew I'd show up eventually, like she was prepared. Then she's afraid, Sarah said. People only prepare that hard when they know they're vulnerable. She closed the folder with a soft thud, pressing her palms on the cover. You're not going to win this with anger, she said. You're going to win it with evidence, and we're going to gather every piece of it. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the old metal door. The lake was calling, but this time not for quiet, for justice. Sarah stood, flattening her jacket. I'll file for certified copies of everything today. We'll compare these documents with whatever Bethany tries to present. But first, I want you to walk the boundaries again. Photograph everything. Every old marker. Every tree line. Every natural edge of that lake. Because when this goes to court, and it will, we'll need the land to speak as loudly as these papers. As she walked toward the exit, she paused. And Remy, this isn't just about you. If the HOA forged one signature, they might have forged others. People like Bethany don't stop at just one grab. The thought chilled me more than the morning wind when we stepped outside. The sky was clearer now, the sun bright, sharp, unwavering. As I climbed back into my truck with the original deed beside me, one thing became unmistakably clear. Bethany Reed had power. But I had the truth, and the truth was older, deeper, and far more rooted than anything she could build on stolen land. The drive back up the mountain felt heavier than it had that morning. Snowmelt pooled in shallow dips of the road, and each time my tires rolled through them, the ripples reminded me of the lake, steady, patient, unwilling to rush. I needed to learn from it now. If I went at this with fists swinging, I'd lose. If I moved with the lake's patience, the truth would settle on its own and show itself. When I reached the cabin, the sky had taken on that quiet, grayish tone that comes before evening frost. I opened the door and set the stack of certified copies Sarah gave me on the wooden table. The surface creaked under their weight, the sound echoing in the empty cabin like someone clearing their throat. I lit a lantern and let its warm glow fill the room. The cabin had always been a place of reflection, a place for silence, a place where every decision felt guided by the bones of the land around it. That silence settled on me now, not heavy, just purposeful. This wasn't the time for speaking. It was the time for watching. I grabbed my camera, stepped outside, and walked toward the tree line. The wind had sharpened, pushing soft waves across the lake's surface. The reflection of the marina flickered unevenly, like the water was trying to shake it off. The first boundary marker stood just beyond the brush. I crouched down and snapped photos from 3 angles: the carved letter, the mossy stones, the tree stump nearby. The camera clicked like a metronome, steady and rhythmic. Click, click, click. Each photo was an anchor against whatever lies Bethany and her team had forged. Each one felt like laying down a stone in preparation for something larger. I moved to the next marker, the bent horseshoe outcrop Carl had shown me. The stones my grandfather stacked sat stubbornly where he left them, as if challenging the modern intruder just yards away. I photographed everything: the stones, the roots, the angle of the ridge, the natural curve of the land. More walking, more clicking. The cold air stung my cheeks and stiffened my fingers, but the steady repetition grounded me. When I reached the shoreline, I stood there for a long moment. The water lapped gently, the evening wind shifting just enough to rattle the reeds. This part of the lake had changed the most. My family's old dock lay half-submerged like a tired relic, while beyond it the gleaming new marina sprawled in sharp lines and bright angles, an uninvited guest overstaying its welcome. A single work light shone from the marina's platform, casting a long reflection across the water, like a spear of white fire. I zoomed in through the camera lens, capturing the pylons, the anchor bolts, the lines of concrete cutting into soil that still remembered my grandfather's boots. As I reviewed the photos, I heard a faint buzz, an engine. I turned. A small HOA utility cart trundled down the slope on the opposite side of the fence, headed toward the water. 2 people sat inside, a man I didn't recognize and another wearing a reflective vest. They drove slowly, scanning the shoreline. I didn't hide. I didn't move. I simply lowered the camera and watched. The cart stopped. The man in the vest stepped out, stared at me through the fence, then spoke quietly to the driver. They lingered a moment longer before heading back toward the marina. They had seen me, and more importantly, they knew I had seen them. But I stayed silent. It was time to let them make their next move. I moved on, documenting everything along the water: tree roots exposed by erosion, an old cedar with initials carved into its bark, even the subtle indentation in the soil marking where our property line traditionally ran. The deeper I walked, the more the land whispered reminders to me. My grandfather's laugh, my father's hand on my shoulder, my mother's quiet encouragement. Proof wasn't just paper. Proof was alive. When I returned to the cabin, dusk had settled like a blanket. The lantern light flickered across the walls. I laid out the photos on the table beside the deeds, letting them form a mosaic of truth. Old ink, old earth, old memories aligning into something stronger than forged paperwork. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly as I studied the spread. There was no rage now, no desperation, only calm focus, the kind that comes in the eye of a storm. I brewed coffee on the propane burner, the rich smell curling through the cabin. While it heated, I grabbed a notebook and began sketching the shoreline from memory, marking each point I had photographed that day. The map wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It showed where the lake had always been strong, where the earth dipped, where the dock beams had been anchored decades earlier. Halfway through my sketching, headlights swept across the cabin window. I froze. No one had any business driving out this far except locals, and they wouldn't come at night unless something was wrong. I set the pencil down quietly, moved to the window, and pulled the curtain back an inch. A dark SUV sat idling in the clearing. For a moment, the lights stayed on, illuminating the brush, the splintered firewood stacked near the porch, the side of the cabin. Then they clicked off, leaving only the faint silhouette of the vehicle against the dark. The driver didn't step out. They waited. Just waited. Watching, maybe. Measuring me the same way I had measured the land earlier. The silence grew heavy again, but this time not the calm kind, the kind that rumbles like distant thunder, promising something is coming. After a long minute, the SUV backed up slowly, gravel crunching under its tires, and disappeared down the road toward the gate. I didn't chase it. I didn't shout into the night. I simply sat back at the table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and looked at the maps, the deeds, the photographs. Silence was still my strongest weapon. Let them watch. Let them wonder what I knew. They had moved first with a forged signature and a fancy gate. Now they needed to worry about what I would do next. The storm wasn't here yet, but the air had changed, and the land knew a storm when it felt one. 2 days later, the calendar caught up with the tension. A notice slid into my mailbox at the cabin. A glossy HOA newsletter printed on thick paper. The kind meant to look official even when the words carried no authority. At the bottom of the first page, in bold, centered letters, was an announcement. Mandatory Community Meeting, Lakeshore Association Hall, Friday, 6:00 p.m. Attendance strongly encouraged. I didn't need to ask who wrote it. The tone had Bethany Reed's fingerprints all over it. Polite on the surface, threatening underneath. She wanted control of the narrative before I could speak. She wanted eyes on her, not on the cracks forming in her paperwork. Fine. If she wanted a show, I'd give her a front row seat to the truth. By late afternoon, clouds stacked low over the mountains, heavy and gray. Wind skated along the lake's surface, pushing waves toward the new marina in small, choppy rhythms. I drove past the gate, still locked, still standing like a wooden jaw guarding stolen ground, and down the newly paved road into the development. Everything smelled too fresh, too artificial, too wrong for this place. The HOA hall hadn't always existed. It was once a simple equipment shed used by the county during reservoir inspections. But they'd renovated it, added big windows and a fancy stone entrance, trying to make it resemble some mountain lodge. It looked out of place like a stranger wearing my father's coat. Inside, the room buzzed. Rows of chairs filled the hall. People chatted. Homeowners with hiking boots and insulated jackets. Retirees clutching stainless steel mugs. Young couples dressed in expensive outdoor gear that had never seen real dirt. Some smiled when they saw me enter. Others looked confused. A few whispered. I recognized 2 of them immediately. The workers who'd watched me from the utility cart days earlier. They stood near the wall, arms crossed. At the front stood a long table. Behind it, the full HOA board sat like a panel of judges, and centered among them, naturally, was Bethany Reed. Her bright pink blazer stood out like a flare in the room. Her expression sharpened the moment she saw me. Surprise flickered, then control returned to her face. "Mr. Cole," she said, raising her voice just enough to carry. "Glad you could join us." I didn't respond. I found a seat near the aisle and sat with my back straight, the folder of deeds and photos in my jacket. Bethany cleared her throat, tapping a stack of papers against the table. "All right, everyone, let's begin. As you know, our community is in a critical phase of development. We've invested heavily in improvements to increase property values and enhance access to our beautiful lake. But," she paused, flashing a tight smile, "we have encountered an unexpected challenge. The room quieted. A man claiming ownership of the shoreline has raised concerns about our ongoing projects. We want to address this matter openly and transparently. Several heads turned toward me. I didn't look back. My fingers rested lightly on the envelope of photos, ready. Bethany lifted a sheet. The Lakeshore Community Association purchased 12 acres of shoreline 3 years ago, all properly documented, all approved by the county, and the signature of the previous owner, Ms. Eileen Cole, is on file. Her voice carried a rehearsed confidence, but in her posture, I saw it, a small stiffness in her shoulders. She wasn't as certain as she wanted the room to believe. One man raised his hand, his voice carrying from 3 rows back. If it was all legal, why's this guy saying otherwise? Bethany straightened. Confusion, I'm sure. Grief can distort memories. A low rumble of murmurs filled the hall. That was my cue. I rose slowly, letting the weight of silence settle over the room. Heads turned. My boots echoed against the wooden floor as I stepped into the aisle. Memories aren't the issue, I said. Evidence is. Bethany's smile tightened. Mr. Cole, this meeting is not intended for confrontational. Good, I said, keeping my voice level. I didn't come to confront. I came with information. I walked toward the front, but not all the way to the table. I stood just before the first row, close enough to speak, far enough to stay outside their manufactured sense of authority. This land was never sold, I said plainly. The shoreline has belonged to the Cole family since 1962, and the deed, the surveys, the water rights, and the historical boundaries all confirm that. Before Bethany could fire back, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the map Sarah had shown me, the hand-drawn survey from the 90s showing my father pointing to the northern marker. The photo was clipped to the corner. I held it up for the room. This is my father in 1994, verifying the same boundary stones that still sit on that lake today. Stones you can walk to right now if you are willing to step outside this heated hall. Voices rose. People leaned forward. A few exchanged glances. Bethany stood abruptly. This is highly irregular. No, I said. What's irregular is a signature on a contract that doesn't match my mother's handwriting. A signature dated during a period when she was physically incapable of writing legibly. The room went dead still. Bethany froze mid-step. A man in the back whispered, "Wait, what?" I saw the calculation in Bethany's eyes, whether she should argue, deflect, or dismiss. But before she chose, I took another step, lowering my voice. I'm not accusing anyone here tonight. I'm stating facts. Facts written on paper older than most homes in this development. Facts recorded before this HOA existed. I let my gaze move through the room, landing on people one by one. I'm not here to stop progress. I'm here to stop a lie. A woman stood up. If what he's saying is true, then is our property line wrong? Another man added, What about our boat slips? Are they on his land? The noise rose like a wind through tall grass, whispers becoming questions, questions becoming doubt. Bethany lifted her hands, trying to reel the room back in. Everyone, please, let's not jump to conclusions. But she wasn't in control anymore. Not of the room, not of the story. I withdrew a single sheet and set it gently on the front row's seat. Original deed, I said. Recorded and certified. Anyone here is welcome to read it. People stood. More questions. More murmurs. And then it happened. Bethany's composure cracked. She slammed her hand on the table. This land was abandoned, she snapped. It needed leadership. Someone had to take control or it would have turned into a wasteland. The room went silent. Not shocked. Stunned. Even she realized what she had said the moment the words left her mouth. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wished she could pull the sentence back into her throat. But it hung there, exposed, ugly, true in a way she didn't intend. Slowly, Sheriff Marcus Hale, who had been standing near the side wall, arms folded, stepped forward. I hadn't noticed him before. He must have arrived late, or quietly, or intentionally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to need that statement recorded." Bethany's face drained of color. In that moment, the storm finally reached the room, not with thunder, not with rain, but with the unmistakable stillness that comes when truth drops like a stone into deep water. I stood there, feeling the shift, subtle but powerful. The land had spoken, and people had finally heard it. The room held its breath after Bethany's outburst. It wasn't just embarrassment radiating from her, something deeper, something cracked open and leaking panic beneath her polished exterior. She had revealed what she never meant to say aloud, and the crowd felt it. You could almost hear the thread unraveling between her words and the authority she tried to wield. Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped forward with the steadiness of someone used to calming trouble before it turned into something worse. His boots were soft on the wood floor, but his presence carried weight. Every eye in that room swung toward him. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Bethany, "I'm going to ask you to repeat that statement for the record." Bethany stiffened, her lips pressing together as if welded shut. The oxygen in the hall tightened. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights above seemed to dim under the tension. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," she finally managed, voice strained. "This community needed direction. The land was unmanaged." "It was private," someone cut in sharply from the crowd. Heads turned. It was Mr. Downs, a retired forest ranger who'd lived in this county longer than half the people here had been alive. His weathered hands gripped a thermos, knuckles pale. "That lake has never been abandoned," he said. "It's just been respected. There's a difference." A murmur rippled through the room. You could sense minds shifting, tiny recalibrations of loyalty and doubt. This was the moment when perception began to drift from HOA order towards something more primal: truth. Bethany exhaled sharply and attempted to regain her footing. "Look," she said, raising both hands, palms outward. "This meeting is getting away from us. We're here to discuss development concerns, not—" Marcus cleared his throat. Just once, soft but unmistakable. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "I'm not here as a resident. I'm here because there are allegations of forged documents and illegal boundary adjustments. When you say the land needed someone to take control, that raises questions. Questions I'm obligated to follow up on." Bethany looked like she'd swallowed a stone. "Sheriff, with all respect, the county approved everything." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to clarify," he replied. Her eyes tightened. For the first time, she looked small in that pink blazer. Fragile rather than formidable. I watched her. Watched the microseconds of panic flicker behind her eyes. It was the look of someone who had built an empire of paperwork on shaky ground and suddenly felt the tremors beneath her feet. I didn't speak. Not yet. Silence was still my ally. Bethany turned toward the board members, 3 of whom avoided her gaze completely. They looked like passengers on a ship that had just hit rocks. Finally, she faced the room. "We will not tolerate misinformation," she said. "This discussion is over. We'll reconvene when we have sorted out the facts." "That's what we're doing now," another voice called. This time it came from a woman near the center row, a mother holding her young daughter's hand. "You can't ask us to trust documents if they might be forged." A man beside her added, "My boat slips on that new dock. If that shoreline isn't HOA property, I want to know before I pay another $1 of dues." More voices gathered behind them, emboldened by each other. Questions layered over questions. Do we own our lots? What about easements? What about access roads? It was becoming a surge, a tide rising fast. Bethany banged a gavel she didn't need to bring. The loud crack echoed through the hall, but it didn't quiet the room. It only made people flinch. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, gripping the gavel like a lifeline. But the room didn't disperse. People stood. They watched her. They watched me. They watched Marcus. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Quietly, I stepped forward, holding the folder of documents at my side. The faint sound of paper shifting carried more power in that moment than any speech I could have given. "Anyone who wants to see the original deed," I said, calm and clear. "I'll be outside." The room went from murmurs to absolute stillness. Then, movement, people rising, turning, following. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to show that belief was shifting, that the truth had weight, that the land's story was stronger than Bethany's narrative. I walked to the door as the crowd parted around me. The air outside was cold, biting, smelling of pine and the faint metallic scent before snow. Overhead, gray clouds pressed low, ready to burst. People gathered on the gravel, waiting as I opened the folder. I showed them the maps first, the handwritten ones with my grandfather's careful lines, then the surveys, then my father pointing at the boundary stones in that old photograph. The wind tugged at the pages, as if the land itself wanted to help unveil what had been hidden. A man near the front, broad-shouldered, wearing a plaid jacket, spoke softly. "These markers, I've seen them. I thought they were trail signs." "They're older than that," I said. Another homeowner asked, "If this is true, what happens to the marina?" I didn't answer immediately. The truth was, I didn't know what the court would decide, but I knew what was right. "If it's on stolen land," I said, "it doesn't get to stay." The small crowd let those words settle. The wind rustled through the trees above us, the sound low and steady like distant surf. It felt like the lake was listening too. The hall door burst open behind us. Bethany stepped out, her expression carved from marble. For a moment, she looked at me like she wanted to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she turned sharply and headed for the parking lot, heels snapping on the pavement. Sheriff Marcus lingered in the doorway, hands braced on the frame. He looked at me, then at the folder, then at the retreating figure of Bethany Reed. "A statement like hers," he said quietly, "doesn't go away." He stepped fully outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. His coat flapped in the wind. "You keep those documents close," he said. "This is going to get bigger before it gets quieter." He wasn't warning me. He was preparing me. I gave a slow nod. "I know." A gust of wind came down from the ridge, hard and sudden, rattling the pine branches overhead. It swept across the lake, lifting tiny whitecaps on the surface. Marcus looked toward the water. "Storm's coming sooner than it looks." I watched the heavy sky, the cold ripples on the lake, the faint outlines of the marina across the water. "No," I said softly. "It's already here." And the land, once again, seemed to agree. The storm didn't break with thunder or rain. It arrived in envelopes, white, stamped, and smelling faintly of printer ink and panic. By morning, 3 letters slid under my cabin door, and 2 more waited in my mailbox. They came from law firms across Montana, each message more polished and icy than the last. "Lakeside Vista HOA demands you cease and desist. You are to refrain from trespassing on HOA property until further review. Legal action will follow if you continue to disrupt operations." The irony stung, but not as much as the final envelope, thick and sealed with embossed lettering. Summons from the county civil court. They were suing me, claiming I was interfering with community operations, endangering public safety, and attempting to invalidate lawful property rights. Bethany had moved fast, but I moved faster. I loaded the truck with the folders Sarah and I had organized, deed copies, maps, photographs, printed email threads, and the preliminary survey data. The lake crouched behind the trees, still silver under an early winter sky. I ran my hand over the old wooden railing of the porch, a ridge worn smooth by my father, and by his father before him. "We've been through worse," I murmured to the land. Then I climbed into the truck and drove toward town. The county courthouse sat like a stubborn relic, stone walls, iron-framed windows, and a flag snapping in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and lemon floor polish. Sarah waited for me in the hallway outside courtroom B, her coat neatly folded over her arm, glasses gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as anyone walking into a fire." Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "Good. That's what we need." The doors opened, and the sound echoed, a low, foreboding boom. People from the HOA were already inside, homeowners clutching folders, board members whispering into each other's ears, and Bethany seated stiffly at the front with Jake Mercer at her side. Jake looked like money had fallen into his lap too easily for too many years. Slim-fit jacket, gold watch peeking from under his cuff. He scanned the room like he owned it, even though the land he tried to profit from had never belonged to him. He caught my eye for a split second, a thin, knowing smile, the kind that said, "You're outmatched." But he didn't know me. Not yet. Court began with procedural pleasantries, but the temperature shifted the second. Bethany's lawyer stood to argue that all development was legally approved. He laid out an orderly narrative. HOA purchases land, obtains county permits, hires reputable developers, builds marina and residential units to enhance the community. And then he said the line that snapped Sarah's patience. "Mr. Cole has no proof that the original deed supersedes the updated property lines." Sarah stood before the judge, even finished acknowledging her name. "Your Honor," she said, "we do." She walked to the center of the room, setting the worn-bound deed on the evidence podium. The metal clink of paper hitting the surface was louder than any shout. "This document, recorded in 1963, she said, tapping the page lightly, clearly outlines the Waverly Cole family's ownership of the lakefront and adjoining acreage. It has never been amended, sold, transferred, or relinquished. It predates the HOA by 51 years. The judge leaned forward. "And you can verify this?" Sarah nodded, sliding forward a certified copy from the county archive. With court-stamped confirmation. The room shifted, leaning, listening. I watched Bethany's face. The confidence drained slowly, like color fading from fabric left too long in the sun. Jake leaned in to whisper something to her. She nodded once, jaw clenched tight. Sarah wasn't done. "We also have reason to believe," she continued, lifting another folder, "that the HOA Development Company, run by Mr. Mercer, submitted boundary maps that were altered to shift property lines without the lawful owner's consent." A ripple broke through the room. Someone whispered, "Altered?" Another voice, "Is that legal?" I saw Bethany stiffen, but it was Jake who reacted, adjusting his tie like someone tightening armor. The judge raised a hand. "Ms. Mitchell, do you have evidence supporting the claim of altered boundaries?" Sarah nodded again, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. We have preliminary GPS readings, photographic documentation, and testimony from an independent surveyor." The judge sat back. "Submit it." Bethany's lawyer objected, but the judge cut him off. "Overruled. The court will review all evidence relevant to land ownership." A tension like winter ice stretched across the room, thin, brittle, ready to crack. When court recessed for lunch, the hallway became a hive of voices, whispers, questions, accusations. I stepped outside, the cold hitting my face with a sting of clarity. The lake's wind traveled across miles of snow-dusted pines, carrying the scent of ice and far-off storms. Jake followed me out. He didn't look angry. He looked entertained. "You're causing a lot of trouble for yourself," he said mildly. "I'm correcting trouble someone else caused." He chuckled. "You think a stack of old papers and a dusty survey will beat a multi-million-dollar development? It's not just paper, it's the truth." Jake shrugged, hands slipping into his coat pockets. "Truth is flexible. Courts care about what's filed, not what's sentimental. You forged the truth." His smile faltered, but only for a fraction of a moment. "You're fighting a machine, Remy. It won't go how you think." I stepped closer, my voice low and even. "You built that machine on stolen land, and machines like that break fast when the foundation cracks." Before he could answer, the courthouse doors opened. Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out, hat pulled low. He looked at Jake for a long, unreadable second before turning to me. "Court's reconvening in 5 minutes." But he lingered just long enough to speak quieter. "They're scared," he said. He didn't specify who. He didn't need to. The afternoon session was different. It wasn't the HOA presenting. It was the judge asking direct questions, sharp questions, questions that sliced through paperwork and polished statements like a saw through wet wood. "Mr. Mercer, who prepared the boundary survey submitted to the county?" "A contracted team," Jake answered. "And who hired them?" "Our development office." "With whose authorization?" Jake hesitated, just long enough for everyone to feel it. Bethany leaned forward, trying to catch the judge's eye, but it was too late. The judge's attention was already shifting, turning toward the place where cracks tend to begin. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, "did you personally review the deed history before starting construction?" Jake paused again. "We relied on the documents provided." "Which documents?" the judge pressed. "From whom?" Silence. That was the moment everything changed. The moment when the court saw, not the polished homes, not the shiny marina, not the HOA's facade, but the possibility of something rotten beneath it all. The moment when words spoken in a heated meeting, words Bethany wished she could swallow, suddenly echoed through the walls of a courthouse. The case didn't end that day, but it shifted, tilted. The storm finally broke, not with rain, but with truth spilling into a room built to hold it. When the judge adjourned for the day, the wind outside had strengthened. Flags snapped harder, clouds moved lower. Marcus caught up with me at the steps. "You did good today," he said. "Better than you know." I didn't say much. "You didn't have to. They said enough." He looked toward the lake where the marina lights flickered against the growing dusk. "This isn't just a dispute anymore," he said quietly. "This is going to trial." And somewhere across the water, I could swear the land exhaled. The trial began on a morning cold enough to sting the lungs, the kind of Montana cold that made sound travel farther and truth feel sharper. Frost clung to the courthouse steps, and the sky above stretched out in a pale sheet, waiting for something to break it. Sarah walked beside me, her breath visible in soft white puffs. She carried 3 heavy binders pressed neatly against her chest, each one filled with documents that could change the direction of everything: mine, the lakes, and even Montana's history of property law. Inside the courthouse, wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of spectators. Ranchers wrapped in canvas jackets, marina owners frowning behind their scarves, HOA residents with tense, folded arms. Even a few reporters sat ready, their pens twitching with expectation. Jake Mercer and Bethany Reed sat at the defendant's table. Jake wore a dark suit too slick for Montana. Bethany wore confidence like a coat, fitted, polished, and trying desperately to hide the cracks beneath. The judge entered with slow, deliberate steps. Judge Rowena Carter, gray hair pinned tightly, glasses halfway down her nose, expression carved from the same stone as the courthouse walls. "Let's begin," she said simply. But what she meant was, let's see who's been lying. Sarah opened the case with a quiet forcefulness that didn't need volume to be powerful. Your Honor, she said, this is a case of land theft, not by violence, but by paperwork, by manipulation, by calculated deceit. She placed the original deed on the projection stand. The screen behind her glowed with the yellowed, decades-old document. This deed, she continued, has governed ownership of the Cole lakefront since 1962. It has never been amended, never been sold, never been relinquished. The judge studied it, her eyes narrowing. Across the room, Jake shifted. Bethany held still, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. Sarah went on. The HOA and its developer submitted a boundary map that contradicts every recorded document predating it. Their map shifts the property line 206 feet to the east, onto Mr. Cole's land. One of the homeowners let out a gasp. Another said, 200 feet? That's the whole shoreline. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, and they didn't just shift the line. They built directly on it. Marina pilings, private docks, even foundations for rental villas, all on land that belongs to the plaintiff. The judge turned her gaze to the defense. Is this accurate? Jake's lawyer stood, clearing his throat. We dispute the interpretation. Sarah didn't wait. Your Honor, we have more than interpretation. She signaled toward the back. Dr. Gwendolyn Shore, the surveyor, stepped forward. Her boots echoed across the courtroom floor, solid, measured, honest. She raised her right hand, took the oath, then began unpacking her equipment diagrams like a surgeon preparing instruments. I conducted a full GPS survey, she said, cross-referenced with the 1962 deed, the county's geological records, and the physical landmarks still standing from the original documentation. She displayed the overlay map. Red lines, the real boundary. Blue polygons, the HOA construction. The blue was entirely inside the red. Not slightly, not debatably, fully, utterly, illegally. The room murmured, building into a wave of disbelief. Judge Carter's face did not move. Dr. Shore, she said, in your expert opinion, is there any scenario where this construction would be legally placed? No, Your Honor. Any margin of error? Less than 6 inches. The structures are 200 feet over the line. A hush swept the room, and then came the twist, quiet but devastating. Sarah lifted a small folder, thin, almost insignificant, except for the weight it carried. This is the original permit application submitted by Mr. Mercer's development company. She handed copies to the judge, the defense, and the clerk. On page 3, she continued, you will see Mr. Mercer's signature certifying the accuracy of the boundary map attached. Her tone remained calm. Her eyes did not. And that map is the one proven false by our survey. Jake stiffened, his hand tightening around the table's edge. But Sarah wasn't done. We also obtained email correspondence through a lawful public records request. In these emails, Mr. Mercer instructs a subcontractor to adjust the lines so the lots will include more shoreline. He says, and I quote, "Don't worry about the original deed. It's old. No one will fight it." The courtroom inhaled sharply, as if everyone's lungs had forgotten how to work until that moment. Jake's lawyer sputtered objections, motions, protests. Judge Carter raised a single hand, and the room fell silent. "Overruled," she said coldly. "Submit the emails." Bethany looked at Jake with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Jake looked only at the table, and then the judge called on the defense. Bethany insisted on testifying. It was her mistake. She took the stand with the kind of poise only someone deeply accustomed to power could muster. Her voice began steady, smooth, authoritative. "I believe the documents were legitimate," she said. "I trusted the developer's team. I had no reason to doubt the map submitted to our board. Sarah let her speak. Let her build her stage. Let her climb higher. Then she stepped forward. "Ms. Reed," she said, "do you recall saying this at the HOA meeting 2 weeks ago? The land was abandoned. Someone had to take control?" Bethany swallowed. I was speaking metaphorically." Sarah clicked a button. The audio recording filled the room. Bethany's voice, crisp and unmistakable. The land was abandoned. Someone had to take control. The silence afterward was heavier than any accusation. Bethany looked around, finally seeing it. The loss of trust, the cracks spreading like fractures through everything she thought she controlled. "It was a figure of speech," she said again, quieter, weaker. Judge Carter watched her for a long, cold moment. Then she said, "That will be all." Bethany stepped down, trembling. Jake refused to testify. Smart, but not smart enough. Closing arguments were short. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She didn't need theatrics. "This case is about land," she said. "But more than that, it's about truth. Truth that was distorted. Truth that was buried. Truth that was nearly stolen." She stepped back. Jake's attorney tried to counter, but his voice faltered under the weight of evidence. And then the jury left to deliberate. It took them 6 hours. 6 hours for 59 years of ownership to reclaim its voice. 6 hours for the lake to speak again. When the jury filed back in, their expressions were set, solemn, resolute. The foreman stood. "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. Fraud, boundary manipulation, illegal construction, violation of water rights, trespass." Judge Carter nodded once, then delivered the ruling. Damages awarded in the amount of $5 million. All HOA rights on the disputed lakefront are revoked. The development shall be dismantled or transferred entirely to Mr. Cole within 6 months. This court will not tolerate fraud. Not in this county. Not in this state. Not on this land. A sound broke across the room, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Bethany's face drained of color. Jake's hands dropped to his sides as if the strength had left them. And I closed my eyes, letting the weight fall from my shoulders like a storm finally breaking. Across the lake, I imagined the wind shifting, the water settling, the land remembering. Justice, like thunder, rolling across the mountains. In the days after the verdict, the lake took on a strange kind of stillness, like it was waiting to see if the world would honor what the court had declared. The wind no longer pushed as hard against the pines, and even the gulls circling over the marina seemed to glide quieter than before. I drove back to the lakefront early the next morning. Cold mist rose off the surface, floating low and slow, hugging the shoreline as if reclaiming space that had been taken from it. The gravel crunched under the tires of my truck, that familiar sound echoing through a place that had once felt foreign to me just weeks before. Now it felt like home again. When I stepped out, my boots pressed into the earth with a heaviness that felt right. For the first time since I'd returned to Montana, the land didn't feel defensive. It didn't feel cornered. It felt restored. The old wooden gate the HOA had erected, large, flashy, designed to look important, now hung crooked. The workers hired to dismantle it had taken the top beams down, but left the posts standing until they returned with the right tools. The once polished sign reading "Private HOA Property" now leaned sideways, half buried in the frost. I walked up to it and brushed my fingers over the metal letters. They wobbled, loose from the screws. "You never belonged here," I said quietly. Behind me, a truck engine rumbled closer. Sheriff Marcus Hale pulled up beside the fence line, stepped out, and pushed his hat back on his head. "Morning," he said. "Looks different already." It does, I answered. Feels different too. He nodded, taking in the half-dismantled structure. I talked to the demolition crew. They'll take down the marina extension next week. After that, the villas. The villas, those tall, glass-walled houses that arrogantly pressed their shadows onto my family's shoreline, glimmered faintly across the lake, their reflections warping in the shifting water. They weren't empty yet. Some residents were still negotiating lease options with my attorney. Others were preparing to move out. But the land didn't care about their negotiations. The land had already decided the matter long before the court did. Strange world, Marcus said softly. Takes a courtroom and a stack of evidence just to get back what should have never been taken. I let out a breath. Sometimes I think the land knew all along, just needed the right ears to hear it. Marcus gave one slow nod, then turned back toward his truck. You did good, Remy. I watched him drive away, the sound of his engine fading into the trees. I walked down the old path that led to my family's original dock. Well, the place it used to stand. The HOA developers had torn it out years ago, replacing it with a franchise-style pier for boat rentals and private jet skis. Now that pier sat quiet, shut down, and taped off while the county reviewed the demolition orders. I stepped onto it, letting the wood creak beneath my weight. The boards were newer than the ones my grandfather built, but they carried a hollow feeling, artificial, unrooted, a temporary intruder on land that preferred things slow, handmade, earned. The water beneath it rippled in long, gentle patterns. Light fractured across the surface like scattered coins, shifting each time the breeze whispered over the lake. It felt like the lake was breathing again. Behind me, the sun crawled over the rim of the mountain ridge, pushing gold across the treetops, the kind of light that made everything feel washed clean. I stood there for a long time, just the water, the wind, the sound of distant cranes beginning their work on the removal of the marina's illegal extensions. No shouting, no meetings, no paperwork shoved in my face. Just quiet. Deep, earned quiet. By mid-afternoon, Sarah drove up in her white SUV. She stepped out holding a thermos and 2 folded documents under her arm. You awake? She asked with a small grin. Barely. She handed me the thermos. Coffee, still warm, still steadying. I've got final agreements from the lease candidates, she said, opening the folder. Some of the homeowners want to stay. They're willing to pay fair market rent and acknowledge your full ownership of the land. I nodded. They weren't part of the fraud. They were misled. That's what we'll put in writing, she said. Fair terms for good people. The rest will move out by spring. Across the lake, a moving truck edged down the community road, stopping in front of one of the glass villas. A couple stepped out, tense, slow, careful. They had that look of people whose dream home had turned into a strange kind of nightmare. Do you ever feel bad? I asked. For them? Sarah asked. Yeah. She lowered her voice, looking out across the water. They trusted the wrong people. That's not a crime. It's just human. Then she added gently, but the land shouldn't pay the price for their trust. A quiet certainty washed over me. She was right. I turned to her. This lake isn't meant to be carved into something unnatural. It's meant to breathe. And it will, she said. Now it can. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low again, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. I walked the shoreline to where the old dock once stood, finding the place by memory alone. I knelt down and touched the cold stones, smooth, river-worn. A small pine knot still lay where I remembered it, half buried. My father had used it to anchor the dock's first rope. I picked it up, turned it in my hand. Got it back, I whispered. Not for profit, not for revenge, but because my parents had trusted me with something sacred. As I stood there, listening to the quiet lap of water, the world felt right again. Not triumphant, not blazing with celebration, just right. And sometimes that was the most powerful feeling of all. I walked back toward the cabin, the light dimming into blue, the cold settling deeper as evening arrived. The gate posts behind me swayed slightly in the wind before one of them finally gave and toppled sideways, crashing into the dirt. The sound echoed across the lake like a final chapter closing itself. The HOA was gone. The noise was gone. The fight was over. I paused at the cabin door, looking once more at the lake, still, reflective, timeless. They thought land was paper, I whispered, but the lake remembered everything. Then I stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind me, and the quiet wrapped itself around the land once more. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about fighting. It's about remembering who you are and what your land means to you. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or fought for what's yours, drop a simple "justice" in the comments. And if you'd like more stories about courage, land, and quiet victories, feel free to subscribe and stay with us a while.